Yo, welcome back. So this is my first podcast with an Anon founder. He's the founder of beans.money or Bean Protocol, and Beans is an algorithmic stablecoin. His name is Publius, and he uses a voice modification system. So this is going to be a crypto podcast, but this is really important because if you've ever used crypto, you've used USDC. And USDC is backed by US dollars. And this means that they actually have a supply limit. So they are capped at the total number of US dollars that they have in their treasury. And this is a problem because one, it's limiting the supply of USDC on the market. But two, the company that runs this, they're a good company, but they're also centralized. So we need a decentralized stablecoin. So this is a problem because if the supply of USDC is limited, that means that the interest rates on borrowing USDC is really high. So for example, I took out a rare refuse loan and the interest rate was 50%. So that's like crazy. It's over a year. So like I've made it back, it's fine, but that's not sustainable for the average person. So Beans is an algorithmic stablecoin that solves this. So anyways, the way that Beans work is that instead of being backed by collateral like a US dollar, they're algorithmically stable based on a credit and debt cycle. And so what this means is that if the price of beans goes above 1, then they print more beans, and this increases the supply of beans. And then if it goes down, there's also incentives for it to go back up. And since their supply is increasing faster than USDC can increase their supply, this means that they can have lower interest rate loans if you need to take out loans. So they can have interest rates on loans for like less than 0.1% is the overall goal. Essentially, the reason that I'm really interested in beans, like one, it is a cool stablecoin, but two, the returns are insane right now. Like I said, they mint beans when the price of beans is above 1. And the way that they do that is that they incentivize people to buy pods. Now, pods turn into beans in the future, and when you buy pods, you go to the back of the pod line. So it's a first in, first out protocol. And so the reason that I bought pods, and I'm not shilling my bags. Like, I think the protocol is going to work with or without my podcast, and I'm just bullish on it. Essentially, what happens is that when the price of beans goes above 1, they print more beans and your pods harvest. Now, the interesting thing is that when you put $1 of beans into buying pods, right now the weather is how many more pods you get per dollar. So right now the weather is 2,280%. That means that for every $1 you put in, you get 22.8 pods. So this is nuts because you can buy all these pods, and then when they harvest, the pods are beans, and then it's worth $1. So you're essentially getting a 22x return on your money. The main question is, when are these going to harvest? I believe that they will harvest pretty soon. The main limiting factor is like demand on beans, and the devs are working on setting up some integrations with protocols that are going to help them harvest faster. But anyways, that's enough explaining. This was kind of a long intro, but this is a cool crypto podcast. Hopefully that gives you like some context for where we're coming from. Thanks for tuning in and enjoy the podcast. Here's Publius. Thank you for being here. Beans is really interesting. I have some beans and I needed to learn some more about it.
Well, thank you for having us. We're excited to be here to chat a little bit about beans and beanstalk.
Mm-hmm. So first off, Publius isn't that the pseudonym of Alexander Hamilton when he was writing?
Yes. So the Federalist Papers specifically are a series of incredibly important arguments that were published to the general public under the pseudonym Publius, arguing specifically for the states to ratify the Constitution. And it also contains a lot of discussion on the Bill of Rights. And yes, we are heavily inspired by, and just to clarify, it's not just Alexander Hamilton, although he is certainly our main inspiration, but the pseudonym also was used by John Jay and James Madison while they were also participating in writing the Federalist Papers together as a group. So those are some incredible American patriots, and we are heavily inspired by both their thoughts and their way of leading the discourse.
No, I love that. I think drawing inspiration from the founding fathers is just a really good, metaphor or analogy to creating, the true decentralized currency of crypto. I think that's awesome.
And a little nugget is that the epigraph in our white paper is also an Alexander Hamilton quote. So we are big fans.
What was it? It's here. I have it right here. A national debt, if it is not excessive, will be to us a national blessing. It will be powerful cement of our union. That's great. Letter to Robert Morris from Alexander Hamilton. Also, just for everybody listening, Publius, this is my first anonymous podcast. So Publius is just using a voice decoder or I don't know exactly how to call it, but yeah. Okay, look, so Beans, as far as I understand, is trying to become, Beans is trying to become the stablecoin of decentralized finance. And so first off, I just want to like briefly give an overview of USDC and then go into DAI. Can you talk about USDC and maybe what was good about it, but also some of the shortcomings?
Sure. The starting place is what is USDC? And when you're talking about USDC, you also have to talk about Tether. So in general, the whole world runs on US dollars today. That is not just transactions that are taking place inside the United States or denominated by a US company. Global trade in general, the vast majority of it is denominated in dollars. Even if it's two countries that don't operate in dollars, they denominate their trade in dollars. And this demand for dollars doesn't just play out in the physical world, it also plays out in the digital world, in the cryptocurrency world. And so as useful as technology like Bitcoin and Ethereum and other blockchain networks is, and in spite of all of the incredible innovations that they facilitate or help facilitate, for the time being, there remains an immense amount of demand for US dollars. Mm-hmm. And so even though you can transact, for example, on the Ethereum blockchain using Ethereum or Ether, we should say, which is the currency of the blockchain, or using any other Ethereum-based currency, to date, there is the most amount of demand for using US dollars on the Ethereum network. So you asked about USDC, which is the second largest stable coin by market cap. And then there's Tether, which is the largest stable coin by market cap. And both USDC and Tether are run by companies. And the general model for these companies is they say, okay, you want US dollars on the block, but dollars exist here in the physical world, not on the blockchain. Mm-hmm. And so what we'll do is you can take your dollars in the physical world, you can leave them with us, you can trust us to hold on to your dollars in the physical world, and we will issue on the Ethereum blockchain or potentially another blockchain one USDC or one Tether. And the companies are basically attesting or asserting that they will hold on to your capital. And because every dollar that they issue on the blockchain, they say they will not issue it unless they have a dollar in their bank account underlying that dollar, there's a reasonable expectation that that coin should be worth $1. And the way that it in practice is worth $1 is if the price is too high or too low, there are arbitrage opportunities where if the price is below $1, you could buy the USDC on the market for 98 cents, go back to the issuer of USDC, Circle, and give them the token that you just bought for 98 cents, and they'll, in theory, give you back $1 in the real world. And the same thing works if the price is too high in the other direction. And from this arbitrage opportunity comes stability. So in general, USDC and Tether are the two largest USD stablecoins to date. And per our earlier discussion, the vast majority of stablecoins in general are USD stablecoins because of the immense amount of demand for US dollars. And this collateralized model, a centralized collateralized model where you're trusting one company to hold on to the collateral, has worked in the sense that they are the most successful stablecoin to date. There's over $100 billion of Tether and tens of billions of USDC. And accordingly, they're certainly adding a lot of value currently to the crypto space. The problems are obviously that you have to trust a centralized party, which is against the ethos of cryptocurrency and decentralization in general. But then there's also an economic problem, which we will talk about in a bit as we get to Beanstalk and why Beanstalk is significantly better than USDC or Tether or DAI. But the first generation stablecoin, which is epitomized by USDC and Tether, is simply that model. We claim, the company, we claim we will hold your dollars in a bank account and we will issue $1 on the blockchain for each dollar of collateral that we have. In practice, that centralization risk has played itself out where now, and obviously it's much discussed, but the assets backing both of those coins are no longer just cash. Now it's been changed to a mix of different assets, separate from commenting on the validity of changing the collateral.
What other assets? Sorry.
No, it's fair. So the short answer is various forms of government debt, commercial paper, which is obviously riskier than government debt. But and it's important to understand why this is happening, why they don't just hold the dollars. Ultimately, it's because these are businesses. Mm-hmm. And in today's environment with incredibly low interest rates, if they are holding $100 billion in a bank account right now, due to the fact that the interest rate environment is so low, they're basically not earning any money on that $100 billion. And specifically, in order to attract more people to USDC, for example, these companies that issue the stablecoins want to offer some sort of native interest rate. So now not only are you holding USDC, you can earn passive interest by staking them or depositing them somewhere.
It's like 30%, right?
It depends on where you're lending it or where you're staking it. But in general, the lending or borrowing costs for USD stablecoins is often in the double digits. So not sure if it gets as high as 30% on a regular basis, but it is regularly in the double digits. And the idea basically being that in order to pay out those returns, especially if the returns are native to the protocol, you actually do need to earn some sort of interest on the underlying capital. So from a competition perspective, like if you look, Coinbase, I'm actually not sure on the exact status of this, but they recently just talked about offering passive deposit accounts for your USDC and wanted to offer you, like, and I am making this up because I don't remember, but 1 to 5% on your USDC. And so in order to pay those returns and pay the bills, these companies are highly incentivized not to just hold $100 billion in a bank account. Yeah. So there's a significant amount of risk introduced from the fact that we are, any use of USDC or Tether is trusting a centralized actor to hold on to this money and manage it in a responsible
and
way.
Actually make good investments that aren't going to blow up. So like, for example, let's just like worst case, if the market goes down, are you saying that USDC could go down as well? Or what would happen in that case?
So that would be unlikely in our estimation. It's impossible to say with certainty in that anytime you don't have one-to-one actual US dollar collateralization, there is some aspect of risk introduced. But in general, in order to assess that risk, it would be determined by the actual assets that they are holding. And my understanding is that they are generally very risk averse with the assets that they diversify into, but that's sort of not the point. The point is that in general, that model A requires a centralized actor to operate it, which is very much antithetical to the ethos of cryptocurrency. But then there's an economics problem that gets introduced here as well, where there just isn't enough dollars that these companies can secure in a bank account to issue enough stable coins to meet demand. And so, and we'll talk about DAI and how DAI is another attempt, But in general, in addition to the centralization, which DAI also suffers from to some extent, there's also a fundamental economic issue here, which is that there is simply not enough not enough supply of USD stablecoins to meet demand for them. And that is why there is such a high borrowing rate or lending rate on USD stablecoins right now. The fact that you can lend out your stablecoins for 10 or 20% a year is the evidence that there isn't enough supply, and specifically the supply not being able to be met by the current stablecoin models is one of the main reasons why, other than borrowing and lending, there's not a ton of use of stablecoins in DeFi right now. Anytime, if you tell me, I'll lend you some money, but at 50% a year or 10% a year, crazy high rates compared to the risk-free rate of return these days, that in practice makes making any sort of bet much less cost effective. And
wow. So I just want to say, like, that was my experience. I loaned some of my staked OHM to Rary and then took out a loan on USDC, and the loan percent was like 40%. And I didn't realize that this was because there was a lack of supply. So you're saying that over time, like right now it might be 40%, but in a few months or so, it could even be like 60% because the supply just isn't there and we can't have enough USDC.
Correct. Mm-hmm. And in general, the model behind minting more USDC or minting more Tether is incredibly difficult to do at the scale of trillions of dollars, because it's very hard to bring that many dollars into your bank account, period.
Mm-hmm. Because so they have to vacuum up all those dollars to do that. So that's just not going to be feasible, I think.
Correct.
So then, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, given the low interest rate environment, that makes it even harder. Like you can't even leave your dollars in a bank account and earn interest on them if they're just sitting there.
Mm-hmm. So how does this get into DAI? How did DAI try to solve this?
So DAI didn't necessarily, and it's hard to speak on intent, but they didn't solve the economics problem, but they did for a time solve the centralization problem. And it's actually pretty tragic. And I'll explain the specifics, but DAI was forced to capitulate to compete with USDC and Tether, and ultimately has had to sacrifice their decentralization in order to compete economically. And so even though DAI was issued and created as a decentralized stablecoin, in practice today, that is not the case. So the mechanics of DAI are similar to USDC and Tether, but fundamentally different because they exist on chain. So unlike this USDC model, where you take $1, give it to Circle, the company that issues USDC, and they give you 1 USDC on the blockchain, DAI is an open source software that allows anybody with an Ethereum wallet to deposit assets into a CDP, a collateralized debt position. Mm-hmm. And so if I have $100,000 of Ethereum, I can deposit those $100,000 of Ethereum in a CDP, and then I can mint up to 2/3. I don't know if that's still the rate. We'll talk about the economic competition in a second. So I'm not the most up to date on the current.
It's the old model, so that's fine.
Exactly, the current settings of the DAI ecosystem. But if I deposited 100K worth of Ethereum into a CDP, I could mint up to 2/3 of that value in DAI.
If Ethereum, let's say, recently it went from 3,000 to 4,500 or 4,700, whatever it's at now. If it goes up, can you take out more DAI?
Correct. Okay. So the only rule enforced by the CDP is that the value of your collateral cannot fall below 150%. Again, the numbers might have changed a little bit. Cannot fall below 150% of the value of your collateral. So if your collateral doubles, you could, in theory, mint double the DAI. But if instead the value of ETH went from 3,000 down to 2,000, and now it dips to 199.99, so the value of your collateral exceeds the value of your DAI, at that point, the protocol would be underwater, if that makes sense, where it has now issued more DAI than the collateral it has kept against that DAI.
So what happens to the DAI price at that point?
So, well, the CDPs are individual CDPs. So any specific position may be over collateralized or under collateralized at any given time, but the DAI price in theory should remain at or above $1, because there is a guarantee that the rule that your collateral must always be 150% of the value of the DAI you have minted against the CDP is enforceable in a decentralized fashion. And so if I minted the maximum amount of DAI that I could mint against my $3,000 ETH, my $100,000 of 3,000 ETH, and ETH goes down even a fraction of a percent, so I'm now below the 150% threshold. Anybody on Ethereum can now come in and close out my CDP. And therefore, keep in mind, your collateral is worth 149% of your deposit. If someone else, so it's under collateralized. If someone closes it out, they basically get to keep the excess. And so the idea being, there's a really efficient market for closing out under collateralized CDPs, and accordingly, the collateral never falls close to 100%. So it's always over collateralized. And accordingly, the value of DAI should never fall below $1, because you know that the collateral is always at least $1. The problem is, you may say, well, shouldn't, because there's actually 150 cents of collateral under each DAI, shouldn't the price actually tend towards $1.50, not $1? And in practice, that was the case. And so DAI introduced a stability fee, where basically when you take out a CDP, and I may be incorrect stating that they introduced it specifically to deal with this problem, so don't quote me on that, but the purpose of the stability fee, we're just focused on being accurate, so we try not to misspeak. But with regards to that stability fee, that was basically introduced as a cost to borrowing DAI. And so now anytime that you're borrowing DAI from a CDP, there's built in, because of the stability fee, a cost of doing business. So, and this is a different cost of doing business, strictly speaking, than the shortage of supply from USDC or Tether. This is a stability fee that is introduced purely to make the over collateralized economics work. So on the one hand, the over collateralized model does work, and there are billions of DAI. DAI is a huge success, but, and this is a big but, the requirement to only collateralize Ethereum, which is highly volatile, was suboptimal for something like DAI. Because if you have an 80% crash in the price of Ethereum, that can result in a major unwinding of debt positions, and ultimately it's pretty inefficient. And so DAI over time basically made the decision to accept in the CDP other collateral than just Ethereum. So whereas Ethereum is kind of the gold standard, or we should say Ether is a gold standard asset in terms of decentralization on the Ethereum network, because the decentralization of control of Ether is basically solely dependent on the ownership distribution of Ether and the miners of the Ethereum network. And at this point in time, Both of those are incredibly decentralized, whereas DAI has started to accept as collateral USDC, which is not decentralized, totally centralized. And on the one hand, the fact that the USDC is much, much, much less volatile means that you can mint more than 150, you don't need to have everything collateralized at 150%, which is again why I said I'm not sure what their current cap on minting is, because I'm not up to date on the specifics. But the idea is that because they decided to accept USDC, it's no longer a decentralized asset fundamentally.
Have they accepted other assets in addition to Ether and USDC?
I would be making it up if I gave you a list
Okay.
of the assets, so I will refrain from making it up. But the short answer is I believe that they have expanded it to more than just Ethereum and USDC.
Okay. And so because they're accepting USDC, they're essentially tying themselves to the same problems of USDC. Is there a larger supply of DAI or USDC?
There's a larger supply of USDC.
Okay. Is USDC like growing, or is DAI growing and maybe going to overtake it anytime soon, or everybody's just using? Because personally, I use USDC. I just think it's very easy. Eventually, I'll use Beans, but
Exactly. So they are both growing very rapidly in the grand scheme of things. In general, both of these assets are major parts of the DeFi ecosystem at this point in time, and accordingly, demand for both of those assets and Tether is going up a lot as DeFi continues to grow, which has certainly happened over the past year. With regards to your question of will DAI overtake USDC, it's sort of impossible to imagine that taking place
because they need USDC for the collateral.
Well, not just that they are dependent on USDC, it comes from the fact that why did they have to move to USDC? The reason is there wasn't enough Ethereum that could be locked up to create the necessary DAI. And so in the same way that USDC needs more dollars, Maker, the issuer of DAI, they needed more collateral. And so they added a bunch of other collateral options. I don't remember exactly which are the other ones like you had been asking, but the idea being, I think, Comp token was added and a bunch of others, with the idea being that more collateral options will potentially increase the supply of DAI. But we're coming to, and this is a great segue into why have we gone and made Beanstalk? It's because fundamentally, any model that relies on collateral doesn't work. And whether that's because of the shortage of collateral leading to a shortage of supply, or whether that's because of over collateralization, which then creates a stability fee, which then also now you have a high cost of use. In both of those instances, the models for stablecoins was insufficient for DeFi. And even though they've been widely used and adopted in a ton of different capacities, they're not good enough. And there are a ton of opportunities and doors that will be opened if the economics issue of a shortage of supply, so high cost to use, if that is fixed. And so just at a macro level, before we get into Beanstalk, if I say to you, you have this cool idea for something that you want to use money for and earn a return, but the cost of using that money for a year is 15%. Whether your bet was profitable or not is a totally different calculus if your borrowing cost is 15% versus 1% or 0.1%. And in general, what we hope Beanstalk will do over the next couple of years is offer dollars on the blockchain with very low borrowing costs. And specifically, the way Beanstalk is able to do this is by not using collateral of any sort. And so by ditching the collateralized model, there is a way, and it's not like current. This is a state that Beanstalk grows into over time, but there is a way to have dollars on the Ethereum blockchain with an unlimited supply, so it can expand to meet demand in real time with near zero built-in cost to use or to borrow.
Mm-hmm. So right now, I think there's around 4 million beans that have been, or at least pods that have been harvested. Is that the total bean supply? And then what would like the rate for borrowing those be? That would be pretty high, right?
So Beanstalk has a two-sided market. So pods, that term you just asked about, pods are the debt asset of Beanstalk, and pods harvesting are when pods become redeemable for one bean each. Mm-hmm. So the way that lending works and a decentralized credit market is one of the main supports underlying Beanstalk. The way it works is if anyone lends beans to Beanstalk, they get pods, and pods are harvested so they can be redeemed for one bean each on a first in, first out basis. So thus far, 4 million, it's a little more than that, 4 million pods have been harvested, which means that to date, Beanstalk has paid off over $4 million of debt, if that makes sense.
So the weather's not the borrow rate. But so, okay, so instead of asking about like the supply and the borrowing, let's just talk about beans in general. So like what I did was I put in Ethereum, and then I guess that was kind of like buying beans, which were pods. And then over time, those pods are harvesting. And so when I spent the Ethereum, it put me in the back of the line, which was, I think my first one right now is at like 11.2 million. And then my bigger ones, I guess, are at like 30 million. And then those harvest. And they harvest because people are supplying credit, which then helps bring the price above the peg. And then you can create new beans, and then the pods will start harvesting. Can we kind of talk about that system?
Absolutely. So to clarify, and it's a key distinction, which is lenders, so pod holders, are not lending to Beanstalk with the expectation that they will get paid back because more people lend to Beanstalk in the future.
Okay,
that
good.
is kind of a Ponzi scheme. Like
good. Yeah, I was concerned about that.
If Beanstalk paid out old investors with new investors' money, fundamentally that's a problem. So that's not exactly the way the model works.
Good.
Indeed, it is good. So instead, Beanstalk has a two-sided market. There's a market for lenders like yourself, and then there's a market for depositors. So one of the main uses for beans today, before Beanstalk has kind of proven itself, has proven that it can keep the price of one, before it's been adopted across DeFi, the only real use for your beans today is to deposit them in the silo, which is the Beanstalk DAO, the decentralized autonomous organization that is responsible for governing Beanstalk. And basically, if you deposit your beans in the DAO, that looks a lot like a passive deposit account in a bank. You take your beans, you deposit them in the bank, and you earn interest every hour that every season, which in Beanstalk is 1 hour, where the bean supply has increased. So if the bean supply increase and you are deposited in the silo, you earn interest every hour that the supply increases.
And what causes the supply to increase?
So the supply increases when the time-weighted average price of one bean over the previous season was more than $1. Mm-hmm. So in other words, if there was too much demand for beans such that the price was averaged above $1 for an hour, Beanstalk will increase the bean supply by the time-weighted average shortage of beans in the Bean ETH liquidity pool on Uniswap. So when we talk about decentralization, building Beanstalk in a decentralized fashion is something we were willing to take on a lot of cost to do. So one example of that is the price oracle for the Bean price is not Bean USDC or Bean Tether, because that would allow the centralized operators of USDC or Tether to potentially have a kill switch where they could just say, we are no longer allowing our tokens to go to this Uniswap pool. Instead, Beanstalk derives the price for one bean by comparing the ratio of beans to Ethereum in the Bean ETH pool with USDC to Ethereum in the USDC ETH pool. And so the price is derived from a proportion, what is the rate of beans to ETH over the rate of USDC to ETH. And therefore we can come to a highly honest price on a bean without any exposure to any operator of a dollar.
Wait, so how does that mitigate exposure though? Because it sounds like in that formula, USDC is still in the formula.
Yeah, great question. So the mitigation comes from what can they actually do to stop Beanstalk. So a more simple version of the oracle might be, we're just going to compare the number of beans in the in the Bean USDC pool, which doesn't currently exist. But if there's an equal number of beans and USDC in the pool, that means the price is one. The problem with that is that Circle at any point in time could blacklist the address of the Uniswap Bean USDC pool. At that point in time, the pool becomes sort of dead or useless, and the whole system could collapse.
And everybody loses their money, I guess.
It depends on how the system, it would depend on a lot of different factors, but there would most likely be a lot of money lost in such an instance. Instead, Beanstalk uses the Bean ETH pool, which, as we talked about, ETH is kind of the gold standard of decentralized assets on the Ethereum blockchain, and then compares itself against the USDC ETH Uniswap pool.
Oh.
And the idea being that even though USDC is in the formula, the only value it serves in the formula is indicating what is actually a dollar.
These are in the liquidity pools. And then correct. So what happens, let's say if USDC fails or something, can you put together a proposal to use another stablecoin, or what happens in that scenario?
The short answer is yes. The oracle has been created in a way that is incredibly modular. So in addition to moving off of Bean ETH and USDC ETH, or adding potentially another stablecoin to that oracle, in theory, you could do a lot of other USD stablecoins. The main problem that has to be solved from an oracle perspective is the answer to the question, what is the current price of $1 US, which is a non-trivial thing to answer on the blockchain without trusting someone to tell you what the price of a dollar is. And accordingly, the way Beanstalk goes about it is instead, let's take a sample price of a US dollar from somewhere that is highly, highly, highly likely to always very closely track the price of $1 US because of the USDC arbitrage we talked about at the beginning of the podcast. And therefore, Beanstalk assumes that the price of USDC is equal to $1 US.
Would you ever have multiple, let's just say like tracking it against USDC, maybe it has like a 0.7 weight and then DAI with like a 0.3 weight or something like that? Would you ever track multiple dollar-backed currency?
In general, that is certainly possible, and it's something we would consider and have considered when creating Beanstalk, which is attempting to solve an incredibly complex problem with potentially infinite variables if you want to make it so. The idea behind our strategy has been to make things as simple as humanly possible. So we have tried to remove any additional complexity and only leave the complexity that is required to create a decentralized stablecoin. So with regards to, moderate modifications to, for example, the Oracle ETH DAI pool and a Bean, some sort of weighting there, as you suggested, and I'm not sure exactly what that would look like necessarily. There's a lot of flexibility, but at this point in time, that sort of complexity would probably do more harm than good.
Yep.
And accordingly, we like to describe Beanstalk as currently being in sort of an infant stage where it's making all sorts of crazy facial expressions and it looks alive and it's real, you feel it, you hold it, but you still need to give it some neck support. You still need to give it support where it needs support, because ultimately it's not a full-fledged adult yet that can support itself out.
Sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to end by saying, from that perspective, those types of tweaks can be made in the future, but they're probably not right at this stage of the game.
Mm-hmm. And so I was going to say that one example of maybe neck holding would be the new BIP2 weather adjustment that's coming out down the pipe. But before we talk about adjusting the weather and how this impacts harvesting and all this, so we discussed the price oracle, and then also the harvesting, or like the pod sowing, and then also the siloing. So those are kind of like the three components, right? Was there anything else that you wanted to like touch on there?
Could you just repeat the three ways that you laid out? I couldn't get that.
Just the decentralized price oracle, and then we also discussed like the pods harvesting, and then there's also the siloing. So to me, that's kind of, those are like the three aspects of Bean protocol that we needed to discuss. And I was just wondering if there was anything else you wanted to add to those.
I think that's generally fair. If you think about the three parts of Beanstalk, you can definitely break them down and think there's the oracle, there's the silo, and there's the field. And the silo being where people can deposit either beans or LP tokens for the Bean ETH pool and passive interest every time the bean supply increases, or in the field where you can not deposit, but you can lend beans to Beanstalk, which is like what you said you did, where, just to lay out that transaction, the beans are lent to Beanstalk. Beanstalk burns those beans, so there's a decrease in the bean supply, and then issues pods. And the pods are added at the end of the pod line. So right now, there are about 45 million pods outstanding, which means that after, you said you were in around 30 million at the end of your pods, that means that after you lent to Beanstalk, another 15 million beans of debt have been issued by the protocol. And this is a nice time to highlight that Beanstalk incentivizes at all points in time for people to lend to Beanstalk in an efficient capacity. Meaning, if right now I think that it is a sufficiently high or attractive interest rate, weather, which is what the interest rate is called in Beanstalk, such that I am incentivized to lend beans to Beanstalk right now, or in your case, you said you lent Ethereum, Beanstalk used that Ethereum to buy beans and then burn the beans. It's the same transaction.
And it gave me, for one bean that I lent and that was burned, it gave me an extra 16 beans because the weather was 1600.
Correct.
I just want to point that out.
Yes. So if you lend one bean to Beanstalk today, you go to the back of the line, but you get a huge multiplier on your beans when your beans get paid out in the future. So right now that weather has actually gone up further. So now for every bean you lend to Beanstalk, you get 21 pods or so.
I as soon as the weather crossed 2000, I sent out a meme where like the guy is on the back of the bus and it's like the cartoon and he's like chuckling. He's like, I'm in danger. And I was like, my wallet's in danger. I'm about to buy more beans because I was waiting until it crossed 2000 to buy more. So I still need to do that. But yeah, it is.
Well, and that is the perfect little anecdote where that is the behavior Beanstalk tries to create, where as soon as you say, oh, this weather is high enough such that I want to lend to Beanstalk, you want to do it right now. Because if you wait even a couple minutes or a couple hours, the pod line may grow, and therefore the time until you get paid back will also grow. So you're incentivized to lend immediately.
And so what mechanisms make it or help it harvest faster? Is this, do we need more people in the silo earning that passive, like whatever the APY on that is, or what makes it harvest faster?
So the rate that pods harvest are determined by the shortage of beans in the bean ETH pool each season. And there is only a shortage when the price is on average above one.
Mm-hmm.
And so in practice, what Beanstalk wants to have happen in order to pay off more pods is Beanstalk needs there to be certain seasons where the price is above one. And anytime there's a season where the price is above one, Beanstalk can pay off pods. So currently, and you say, well, why would the price be above one? The price would be above one because there is demand for beans. So in general, going back to how pods are not harvested because more people are lending beans to Beanstalk, there is a second side here, which is the silo, as you suggested. So at scale, the bean price may be too high because another protocol integrated beans and there was lots of demand for it, or there may be a million other reasons that cause short-term demand for beans. But today, again, still in an infant stage, the main use case for beans, other than sowing them in the field, is to deposit them in the silo. And so an increase in depositors in the silo would be one of the things that would cause a decrease, or a payment of pods, a harvest of pods. But in general, over the next couple of months, as the price of one bean continues to hang out plus or minus $1, our expectation is that beans will start to be integrated with other protocols. And at that point in time would be when we expect there to be a major uptick in utility and therefore demand for beans. So the general idea here is people are lending beans to Beanstalk with the expectation that the uses for beans will grow in the future, if that makes sense. So you're not lending to beans expecting there to be more lenders. You're lending beans expecting there to be more uses of beans and utility for beans and demand for beans in the future.
So what are some of those use cases for beans? Like, obviously you can just kind of say like, okay, it's whatever USDC does, but what are the use cases for beans that you see maybe short term, like coming up soon?
Sure. So step one in becoming the ubiquitous stablecoin of DeFi is to start to have various trading pairs against Bean, and to potentially also be able to borrow and lend out the Bean token. And so in terms of direct integration over the next couple of months, you should expect there to be the launch of like a Bean lending pool. We're still in the stages of picking, and to some extent anyone could do it today because Bean is an ERC20, but we're still in the stages of picking where we want Bean to kind of be borrowable or loanable first. And it's important to go ahead.
Is Rary one of the options for this? Like, could you borrow beans on Rary or something?
Basically everything is being considered, and I'm not going to comment on Rary specifically, just because a lot of details there that we wouldn't want to necessarily misspeak on. But in general, beans can be used in any lending protocol.
Okay.
Sorry, I just hit my microphone.
Yeah, all good.
I should be good.
Yeah, I can hear you again.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I can hear you again.
Cool.
So we were just talking about the use cases for beans.
No, yeah, I think that was the end. So if you want to ask another question.
Okay.
Sorry, it got a little, I got confused hitting my microphone. Apologies.
Yeah, that's all good. So in the future, so BIP2, I believe is what it's called, is going to reduce the weather, because previously the weather has been increasing or just staying at like zero increase. It hasn't had any like negative impact to the weather in the protocol. Can we just talk about BIP2 and what that does and why that's good?
Sure. So Beanstalk doesn't set the weather, or it doesn't set like here is in a predefined way what the weather will be.
Mhm.
Instead, Beanstalk is generally a reactive system. And so Beanstalk looks at based on at the top of every hour, Beanstalk looks at the previous hour, looks at the price, the time weighted average price. It
Mhm.
looks at the debt level, so the current debt level of Beanstalk, and it looks at the change in demand for soil, the change in demand for debt, change in demand for pods. These are all different. They're more or less the same for the purposes of this conversation, and adjusts the bean supply. As we said, if the price is too high, increase the supply. If the price is too low, increase the soil. So increase the amount of debt Beanstalk is willing to issue, increase the number of tokens Beanstalk is willing to burn. And in addition to increasing the bean supply, increasing the soil supply, potentially every season, Beanstalk can also change the weather. So
Mhm.
right now the weather is, let's call it 2000. At the top of the next hour, Beanstalk can change the weather as much as 3%. So it can lower the weather 3%, or it can raise it 3%. It can lower it 1%, it can raise it 1%, or it can keep it flat. The way that is determined is based on, again, the price, the debt level, and the change in demand for soil. So there are three variables there. The price can be one of two. The debt level can be one of four different options: excessively low, reasonably high, or excessively high. So 2 times 4 is 8. There are 8
Mhm.
different options. And then there are 3 different types of states for demand for soil: decreasing, steady, or increasing. So 2 times 4 times 3 is 24. So there are 24 unique cases that Beanstalk handles and changes the weather in each of those 24 cases, anywhere from -3 to +3. And go ahead.
What was the second one? It was because
Debt
there was
level.
so there's debt level, and then there's, because soil is the debt, right?
Pods are the debt.
Pods are the debt. What is soil?
Soil is the willingness to issue debt. So if you, like when you lent beans to Beanstalk,
Mhm.
you sowed them, and you
Mhm.
sowed them in soil. So today, Beanstalk isn't willing to issue an infinite amount of debt. It's willing to issue a specific amount of debt. And the debt that it is willing to issue is defined by the soil. So for every soil outstanding, Beanstalk is willing to borrow 1 bean from anyone who wants to lend it to Beanstalk. So right now, the soil is almost 6 million. So Beanstalk is willing to accept another 6 million beans and burn them and issue pods, if that
Okay.
makes sense.
Okay. So they would do a max of like 6 times 20 pods is the max that you can buy right now.
Correct. So 120 million pods if you had 6 million beans,
Mhm.
which today would be pretty hard to get access to because there's only
Yeah.
25 million beans or so circulating total.
If somebody did that, I mean, that would harvest a lot of beans, right? Because then,
Exactly.
yeah.
Exactly right. And so the only way this is the way that the system ultimately works, is that the next person, like as there's demand for beans, whether that's to lend to beans, to use beans, to deposit them in the silo, if that raises the price above 1, that moves Beanstalk into a state where it is starting to increase the supply again. And
Okay.
Beanstalk increases the supply until the price goes back below 1, and then it stops increasing the supply.
So
And
when people use beans, like let's say on other protocols, there's demand for beans, that reduces the available amount of soil.
the only thing that reduces the available amount of soil is a
Okay.
bean being lent to Beanstalk.
Okay.
Otherwise, the Beanstalk remains willing to issue the debt. And to answer where we started this on kind of what is the point of BIP2, where we're changing the weather potentially, is 4 of those 24 cases. So 4 out of the 24, we are modifying the weather changes to be slightly more negative. So what that means is in 4 cases, and we can say specifically those cases are when the debt is too high, when the price is too high, and when demand for soil is increasing or steady. So there's net positive demand for soil. So price is high, debt level is too high, which is where we're at right now. So that's like, these are current changes. I mean, they're going to affect the current state of Beanstalk in those specific instances, in those seasons where there is increasing demand for soil and the price is too high. Beanstalk will be a little bit more aggressive in lowering the weather, in lowering the interest rate. Mm-hmm. And the reason for the changes is, in general, Beanstalk and the parameters for Beanstalk have been set in a relatively conservative manner. And specifically, going back to Beanstalk is in sort of an infant stage, part of the conservative nature was in a conservative setting of those 24 weather cases. And on the one hand, that conservative initial parameters have been, just from a history perspective, incredibly great and beneficial, and helped Beanstalk aggressively raise the weather quickly enough such that it was able to return the price of one bean to $1 after, kind of its first major test.
After it went down to 0.2.
Correct. And so we look at something like that and say the weather was set sufficiently conservatively. And again, conservative in this case means raising the weather fast enough. So now Beanstalk is going to be, if the bid passes, and it looks like it's going to pass, and that's more than a majority currently voting for it, all this will do is, in those very specific scenarios when the price is too high and the demand for soil is increasing or steady, in those cases, Beanstalk will be slightly less conservative, slightly more aggressive, and lower the weather a little bit more than it currently does. So in practice, this is actually a really small change in the code itself. It's changing a couple numbers. It's not a functional change to the way Beanstalk operates, but what it is a minor tweak to try to get Beanstalk into an even stronger position heading into the future. And sort of what this demonstrates is that the contract has been written and designed in a way such that the general macro status of the system does not need to be regularly modified, but the micro stuff in the system can be very easily, lightly, and cleanly slightly adjusted in order to make Beanstalk more likely to succeed. And so part of having a protocol that is, Beanstalk is credit-based, which means that the stability for the bean price ultimately comes from the credit of Beanstalk, the protocol itself. And so having a credit worthiness of the protocol is fundamental to that model. So you don't want a protocol that every couple months or every couple years is going to totally change up its MO, because that will most likely significantly hurt its long-term ability to attract credit. So one of the things that Beanstalk does is it allows you to be nimble and make very clean, light tweaks to certain parameters without actually changing the structure of Beanstalk, which obviously, when we talk about building trust over a longer period of time, is essential.
So by lowering I think it's great that you can modify these things that don't modify the protocol at a larger level. By modifying the weather and making it lower, is this kind of saying that you're confident that there are still people who will sow even at lower weathers? And then also, like, if the weather's lower, that means everybody that sows gets less pods, but then, like, the person behind them will kind of harvest faster because the person before them got less pods. So people will start harvesting faster once they start harvesting.
Yeah. So the weather and how changes in the weather affect future demand for soil is a really fascinating question. In general, the way we think about these weather changes is not that the weather itself is being changed. Instead, it's one layer removed from that, the changes to the weather are being changed. And so it's very hard to say the
Mm.
weather will go down or will go up based on these changes. All it is saying is the weather is more likely to go down than it currently is. And so the specific course of the weather over the next couple weeks and months, as Beanstalk continues to grow, assuming that this BIP ultimately passes, the weather over time is going to be different than it otherwise would have been without these weather changes. But beyond that, it's very hard to predict how specifically that will manifest itself. But just to say, the weather changes are certainly an indication that, and the fact that Beanstalk can be slightly more aggressive is certainly both an indication of and a result from the fact that Beanstalk is doing pretty well. This is a move that is made by Beanstalk, not to project, but to say things are going very well. They can be going even better. And so it's really a question of good, better, best. Now, go ahead.
Sorry, no, go ahead.
Weather changes right now are good, but they can be certainly made better in the future. And ultimately, the hope is that at some point there will be a set of best weather changes that maybe never needs to be changed. But given the novelty of Beanstalk, there's a ton of data that is going to have to continue to come in until any sort of final weather changes, if that is ever a possibility, will ultimately, be doable.
Would you say that Beans, just the protocol in general, is doing better than you expected, or do you wish it was doing better, or how are you what's your happiness level with this post launch?
So the answer to this has to be in the context of like 5 weeks into the protocol, Beanstalk went through like a major test, which was a huge pump and dump by people that didn't really understand Beanstalk. And we can talk about that in the context of this answer, but the punchline is we are over the moon. We've put our heart and soul into Beanstalk and worked for basically 9 months, close to full time, to get it launched on mainnet. And we honestly couldn't be happier with the response from, the biggest thing is the community that is growing around Beanstalk, and specifically the quality of the community members. Like just in the past 48 hours, Beanstalk hired 2 new developers, one on the front end, one on more of the middle, that are really high quality. And one of the things that we were most concerned about was how to build a decentralized team around Beanstalk, given that we are anonymous and can't really leverage our own personal networks. Mm-hmm. And the fact that there's been such a high quality of talent interested in spending their time on Beanstalk has totally blown us away. And we're very, not to sell the project, but we're very excited to continue to work on, it looks like we're going to get to continue to work on Beanstalk for another year at least. And there's nothing that could, there's nothing we would rather be doing than to have that opportunity. So to ask about our state of mind, it is incredibly positive at this point in time.
Nice. That's great to hear. Yeah. And the community is incredible. There are so many people that I know that have Bean accounts now and are spreading the good word. And it's like, you can be a humble farmer, and it just has the harvest moon. It just has all of these great components. Like, where did you actually come up with relating it to a bean field?
It was a lightning in a bottle, hard to say. And in fact, the moment the idea occurred, I said to myself, at some point, I'm going to have to explain where this came from, and I got nothing.
Okay.
It was an apropos metaphor, and we just kind of ran with it.
Mm-hmm. No, that makes sense. And so, speaking of the team working 9 months on this, so I know that Ohm has P-Ohm, and it vests over time, and they're incentivized as the DAO, or however it's structured, the multi-sig wallet to work on Ohm. Same with Klima, they have P-Klima. I've heard that you guys don't have any P-beans, or pre-beans is what that means. How are you guys incentivized for this project?
Sure. So going back to we've really gone and taken on cost to make Beanstalk as decentralized as possible, and larger than that, to put Beanstalk in the best position to succeed as possible. We felt that it would be totally inappropriate to have some sort of team allocation or pre-mine or VC round or anything of the sort. So Beanstalk is not a seniorage token, something like Basis or Basis Cash, where the only way to get access to the governance token, or the token that is basically where you would expect people to price future growth of the protocol, is to have been in the early days. And then it's basically, if you were in early, you make lots of money. If not, too bad. And we really, A, we're ethically opposed to that, but B, we think that the best way to get Beanstalk up and running is to just have a good economic model. And if the economic model works, the rest will sort itself out in the right way. And so ultimately, we did not take any sort of team allocation. There was no pre-mine and the first 100 beans were minted when the Beanstalk contract was deployed. And for reference, there are 100 beans at least minted every hour to cover the cost of the sunrise function call, which happens at the top of every hour. And so even from Genesis, the inflation schedule was 100% according to the normally functioning algorithm. And any beans that Publius owns have been purchased just like anybody else. And so the team certainly has skin in the game. We own beans and seeds and stock, which is the governance token, just like everybody else. And we own pods just like everybody else. But in general, there is no special status. There's no special allocation. There's nothing at all. And again, just to restate, our mindset is that if Beanstalk is successful, we'll be sufficiently compensated, and therefore, why cut corners?
Yep.
When you
so the stalk, the stalk is essentially like how FRAX is a stablecoin and FXS is the government token that goes up. Stalk is also going up.
So currently, Stalk is not liquid, but in the near future, it will become an ERC20 token. We're talking, probably early 2022. And at that point in time, the future price expectation or future growth expectations in the bean supply can start to be priced not just in stock, but in seeds. The sort of the silo, the DAO, has a unique structure where if you deposit a bean into the silo, you receive 1 stock and 2 seeds. And stock is the governance token that entitles you to a vote, and it entitles you to your portion of future bean mints, supply increases. But seeds entitle you to 1/10,000th of a stock every season. So, and just to complete the rules in the silo, if I withdraw my bean, I have to forfeit all of my stock and all of my seeds and all of my stock from seeds from that one bean. And so in practice, we talked about how Beanstalk is not a seniorage model or doesn't employ a seniorage model. This is why. There's no way to get governance tokens without depositing beans in the silo. And like when you leave the silo, you have to burn all of your governance tokens. So there is no aspect of put in money in a very early day, and then at some point you get to take all of your capital off the table and still collect all the upside. That's a seniorage model. With Beanstalk, that is fundamentally not the case. The only way to get stock and seeds is to deposit them in the silo, or you could buy them on the open market, but once they're liquid. But fundamentally, the fact that the only way to mint them is to buy beans and deposit them, and more than that, that the pricing of that whole ecosystem will enforce an arbitrage there, where you can't have the price of stock and seeds run wild because anybody can buy a bean, deposit it, and then sell the stock and seeds at a profit. There's all sorts of natural arbitrage that gets introduced there that ultimately should have a really symbiotic effect on the stability of the bean price.
Okay. I don't understand. How is that a symbiotic effect on the bean price? How does it help the bean price? Because it locks up beans?
So there's a couple ways. First is, let's say that you want to speculate on the future growth of Beanstalk. The way to profit from that is to get stock and seeds. So you can buy a bean and deposit it and then get your own stock and seeds, or you can buy the stock and seeds on the open market.
If you deposit a bean and then you get stock and seeds, can you sell them on the open market, or
correct?
are those locked?
It's just that you can't withdraw your bean unless you have the appropriate amount of stock and seeds to burn to make the withdrawal. And so in practice, over time, you should have assets that are in the silo that are kind of stuck there in perpetuity because the stock and seeds on top of them have been sold.
Okay. And that stabilizes the price, is what you're saying, of beans, because it locks them up?
Well, it's symbiotic to the bean price and bean stability because, and we have to add one detail here, it's not final, but the way we envision it is that stock and seeds will become liquid in natively incentivized pools, just like the Bean ETH pool is incentivized by Beanstalk. If you deposit one bean worth of the Bean ETH LP token into the silo, instead of one stock and 2 seeds, you get 1 stock and 4 seeds. So there's an incentive to deposit LP tokens instead of beans into the silo. But the current idea is that stock and seeds will be implemented in a similar fashion in trading pools against bean. And in practice, what that means is, even if you're not going to buy the bean and deposit the bean, if you're going to buy stock and seeds on the open market from Ethereum, first that transaction buys beans and then buys stock and seeds. And so the point is, the whole ecosystem will be created in a way that is net positive in terms of demand for beans.
More demand. That's the same thing that Klima did with BCTs, or their base carbon tons. Every time you want to swap whatever for Klima, it has to go through a BCT, and that creates more demand for the carbon that's in their treasury. So I understand that. Okay, that's good that it creates more demands for beans. Did you have something more to say there, or?
No, that was it.
Okay. So one of the things is, like, right now, when I look at the time to harvest for, if you were harvesting right now, I think it's 10,000. No. It's about 1 year. It's maybe 10,000 seasons, which turns into around 1 year or so. And so this is more of a broader question, like beyond just like the 10,000 seasons or 1 year, but like, if it takes a long time for people's pods to harvest, and then people might just like not want their money locked up in that because of the illiquidity. So one question is, like, will this start happening a lot quicker? And that's obviously with the demand for beans. But the second question is, like, more meta risks. Like, what are the risks to this protocol that concern you, that you're working against? I don't know if you're talking, but you might be on mute.
So with regards to that first question on the pod line getting long, yes, you're totally right. And the one way that Beanstalk fails, and this is said explicitly in the white paper, is if it can no longer attract creditors. So if that is because the pod line is so long that nobody thinks, no matter what the weather is, it is attractive to lend to Beanstalk. If Beanstalk can't attract creditors, ultimately that would be the kiss of death. And so at the same time, that is the battle, or that is the main question that Beanstalk is trying to solve, which is, like, how can it set an interest rate in an efficient enough way that never happens? And so specifically to answer just the how does that never happen in Beanstalk, one really nice feature of the pod line as it currently works is that there is even though it's sort of like a step function, there is a continuous nature to the value that the lenders are valuing Beanstalk. So for example, right now there are 45 million pods and like a 25 million supply of beans currently. So if you lend to Beanstalk right now, your pods go at the back of that line, 45 million.
Mhm.
And half of all beans supply increases go to paying off pod harvests, and half go to paying off stockholders in the silo. And so if there are 45 million pods, in order to lend to Beanstalk today, I have to assume that 90 million beans are going to get minted at some point in the future.
Mhm.
And so if I lend some money to Beanstalk, if I lend money, let's say $10,000, we'll put a 20x multiplier on that. So that's now $200,000. And then you double it because the pod line go to 45.2. So 45.2 doubled is now 90.4. We're basically saying that the previous person lent to Beanstalk, valuing Beanstalk at 90 plus 25 is 115 million. The next lender will have to lend to Beanstalk, valuing it at 115.4 million. And so even that's where the step comes, right? Like a $10,000 chunk increases the value that you're lending to Beanstalk by, currently a 40x, but that is still a somewhat continuous valuation, meaning that Beanstalk doesn't go from being lent at a $90 million valuation or a $115 million valuation to immediately being lent at a $200 million valuation. Instead, it's continuous. And therefore, the next lender does have some assurance that like someone just lent to Beanstalk like at the next best price. And then to answer your larger question about sort of risk vectors at this stage of the game, right now, as we said, Beanstalk is still in an infant stage. The number one thing it needs, and it's not like it needs it immediately, but over the next year or so, is growth to go from an infant stage to more of a toddler stage, to continue with as you can tell, we like to play analogies until they're dead.
Yeah.
So if to get Beanstalk into a toddler stage, the number one thing that could happen between now and then is basically a major outflow in beans. If suddenly 2 million beans were to be dumped in a couple hours, that could potentially tank the price back to 50 cents again, for example, if it were 2 million beans. And it remains to be seen whether at this stage of the game, Beanstalk can successfully navigate another major debt cycle without first paying off all the debt from its first debt cycle. So that doesn't mean the dips to 90 cents or even 80 cents aren't reasonable over the next couple of months, but like another major outflow before Beanstalk can start to pay off more of its debt and create more of a positive feedback loop, another major negative feedback loop would be a big problem at this stage of the game. Now, it's important to comment that is highly, highly, highly unlikely because of the underlying structure of the incentives in Beanstalk. So anyone that was going to leave Beanstalk should have already done it already. Is what the incentives say. So anyone that was going to withdraw their assets from the silo during the debt cycle should have done that already. Now that they're starting to earn interest again because the price has started to hang out above one sometimes, it makes a lot less sense for them to withdraw. And that the withdrawal data has shown that, where basically over time, the withdrawals, if you kind of start at the big dump after that pump and dump in September, have been continuously coming down and are now sort of close to zero. So when we talk about outflows, outflows are close to zero, which is very positive. So the number one thing that could kill Beanstalk at this stage of the game, currently none of that is happening.
That's awesome. So one of my last questions is that marketing is super important for this, and you have a community that's really strong, but how are you working on marketing it and growing it? Or how can we help, I guess? How can we help market and grow it?
Yeah, well, I was going to say the first thing is we're here talking to you, Jack. So in general, and I think this is something that everyone that's heard us talk for now over an hour it will ring true, is that we, Publius, are not trying to sell Beanstalk. We are not comfortable selling Beanstalk in any sort of salesy sense, and instead just want to talk about Beanstalk and explain Beanstalk and answer honestly how it works. And we think that is compelling, and the model demonstrating that it works is compelling enough. And that obviously, this is not to say that marketing and getting the message out there and bringing awareness to Beanstalk isn't incredibly important, but it's something that we're going to hope over time our community leads more and more of the effort in, and we're already starting to see that. So we were connected to UJAC through a member of our community, and that gets us very excited that people that have exposure to Beanstalk and have interest in Beanstalk are leveraging their networks to make things happen. So
I've got a few friends harvesting.
Exactly. So our attitude is that this is still very early days. In about a week, we're going to celebrate 100 days of Beanstalk, which on the one hand is very, very early for what we want to accomplish, but on the other hand is a very, very long time if you look at the history of other algo stablecoins. And so we're excited with what has happened. We're excited with what is to come. And at least on that front, our mindset is continuing to push high quality work, high quality content, transparent communications. That's what we can do to put Beanstalk in the best position to succeed in the long run.
Mm-hmm. I guess, I guess we didn't really talk about other algorithmic stablecoins. Do you think it's worth diving into that a little bit, or?
We could go all day on them.
Yeah.
Really, we could.
I think we'll maybe part 2 or something.
We would maybe be happy to do. Absolutely.
Maybe so like I want to have, the way that I think about my podcast is kind of like, Joe Rogan has like recurring guests and you get to know them over time and like see them grow. And so I think like, see you grow, like see the beans and everybody harvest. Maybe when my 11 million pods, or maybe my 30 million pods inline harvest or something. But yeah, we should definitely do another, and we can talk about more. But what you were saying there about your vision, about how you're moving forward, maybe we should like tie this back to the USDC and DAI conversation. How if Bean really just plays out, like give me the expansive vision and why this will overtake USDC, or what exactly this massive vision is.
Okay, so the number one problem is that for stablecoins is that the cost to use them is too high. And it is too high because there's not enough supply to meet demand to mint the stablecoins such that the borrowing costs to use them go down. Beanstalk fundamentally changes this relationship because Beanstalk doesn't have collateral. And so therefore, Beanstalk will be able to mint enough beans to meet demand for beans, no matter how large demand gets. Mm-hmm. And in practice, what that means, and the way it actually gets to the state, is over the course of many larger and micro cycles within this. But ultimately, if there is the right amount of supply of beans such that the price is one and all demand for beans is met, so there's no excess demand driving the price above one, there will be no new beans minted. And if there are no new beans minted, that means that there's no use in leaving your beans deposited in the silo or in a lending contract earning, whatever percent. You have to go elsewhere because there's no inflation or return coming from being in the silo. Whereas currently at this stage of the game, there is a high level of attraction to being in the silo. Right now, it's paying out over 100% per year based on like the trailing 7-day average APY on our website. But the idea is that once demand is met or filled, there's no more return for staying in the silo. And what that means in practice is that there's no underlying borrowing costs to using beans. And so over time, what will happen is that you will have beans being as a dollar that you can use anywhere you want in DeFi, but the carrying costs are going to approach zero. And so in practice, you'll have a dollar on Ethereum that anything that has a positive expected value, even if it's 50.1, is going to be profitable to do, making your market in beans. And the reason it is orders of magnitude better than USDC or Tether or DAI, separate from the decentralization aspect, is this, that you are going to have stable coins that are much cheaper to use than collateralized ones. And it's as simple as that.
That is a perfect summary right there. I know we had touched on all of those things, but that was the perfect summary. Was there anything else that I should have asked or that you wanted to talk about?
Well, thank you, Jack, for having us. I think you did an amazing job and asked a ton of relevant questions. And, we're happy to do this when your pods harvest or whenever you would like. This has been a pleasure.
Yeah. Thank you for coming on. Where should people, follow you on Twitter and Discord? Give the shout outs.
So on Twitter, it is at Beanstalk Farms. The website is bean.money. And at the bottom of the website is links to anything you could possibly want. And so that's probably the simplest way for anyone to inquire more.
Okay. And it also has a link to the white paper, which is really fun to read. I think that was a pretty funny meme when it was posted. Did you kind of know that would become a meme, that the white paper was just so kind of nut? Did you kind of anticipate that?
Well, candidly, Jack, we're not assholes. So the white paper wasn't written like that just for shits and giggles. Or frankly, our hope is that over time, Beanstalk will be successful, totally independent of Publius. Reliance on us is an area of centralization, is a risk vector, and is something that we certainly want over time to disappear entirely. It's important to note that we are obviously committed to Beanstalk and doing everything humanly possible in our power to make Beanstalk a success. But at the same time, we have the humility to realize Beanstalk has to succeed separate from Publius. Mm-hmm. And so the white paper was written, to include every rule built into the protocol. So if someone read the white paper, it can serve as an accurate description of the protocol and a complete description of the protocol. And we've continued to update the white paper after each BIP such that the white paper remains a current statement of how the system works.
That's perfect.
So that's
you're
why
right.
we did it.
You're right. I have tried reading some docs for things, and it's not explanatory enough. So I actually do appreciate how in-depth the white paper was. It was just funny when I first read it, seeing all of it. But yeah, I do appreciate the detail.
Everyone tends to have that reaction of like, what in God's name is going on here? But if you spend enough time with it, you warm up.
Yep. Okay, awesome. This was great. I will talk to you after the harvest moon,
Incredible. Thank you so much for your time, Jack. We really appreciate it.